Okay, so this is the first video for Chapter 10. And Chapter 10 is basically all about the last two budgets, so 17-18 budget and the 18-19 budget, and how they can impact the economy and how they're likely to impact growth and inflation and full employment. In these first few videos, we're going to look at a few key relationships between budget outcomes and debt, what's meant by good and bad debt, and the difference between underlying and operating budget outcomes. So, government debt. What we know already is that a budget deficit means that in any given year, a country is spending more than they are earning. In Australia, when we run budget deficits, the government has to borrow money. And they do that through what we call either selling bonds or what we call Commonwealth government securities, otherwise known as bonds. The purchasers of these bonds become lenders to Australia, and the more bonds we have issued, the more debt we're in, or more Commonwealth government debt we have. So whenever we run a budget deficit, the size of our net government debt increases. At the moment, Australia has gross debt of over $500 billion, so the Australian government owes the rest of the world around $500 billion at this point in time. Whenever we run a budget deficit, spending exceeds earning in that year, and that leads to increased debt because we need to borrow. The total net debt is gross debt, so the total amount the government owes minus what we've lent to other countries. So you'll hear the words gross and net government debt. Gross government debt is larger because it's all the government's debt, when net debt is what we've borrowed minus what we've lent to other countries. Our net debt is around $330 billion, so not as high as our gross government debt. A budget deficit will always increase net government debt. Okay? And this is a key mistake not to make. When we run a smaller budget deficit, okay, that means the gap between expenditure and revenue has gotten smaller. It doesn't cause net government debt to go down. Because we're still spending more than we're earning, net government debt will just be going up at a slower pace. Net government debt will only go down if a country runs a budget surplus. If the government can run surpluses and earn more than they spend, then we can start paying off our net government debt. But while the deficits are only getting smaller, it just means that net government debt will grow at a slower pace. So in this graph here, in all of these years here, when the budget deficit is getting smaller, this black line, what that's saying is that we're still in deficit. It's only in this last year when we run a surplus of $7.4 billion, this bit here, that would actually start reducing our net government debt. Also, a couple of key terms. There's a difference between net government debt and net foreign debt. Net government debt is all the borrowing from the government. What the government has borrowed from Australian banks and privately, as well as from overseas. So net government debt is all borrowing from the Australian government, whereas net foreign debt is all the debt owed to other countries by Australians, both the public and private sector. So for example, net government debt would include all the money that the government owes to both the private sector and overseas. Net foreign debt is the debt of both the private sector and the government, but only to overseas. So it's not debt, between Australians there. It's just the debt we owe to other countries. So net government debt would include the government's debt to the private sector, but net foreign debt wouldn't. Where net foreign debt would include private debt that Australians owe to other countries, where net government debt wouldn't, because it's not debt from the government. Gross government debt is not necessarily a problem. It's what net government debt is the problem. So it's not an issue with the government having a lot of debt to other countries because other countries might owe us a lot of money as well. It's that net difference that's what's important. If the government has a lot more debt owing than what they are owed, that's when it becomes a problem. When we're talking about government debt, you need to be able to link the impact of automatic stabilisers on government debt. So what I mean by that is, how does the automatic stabilisers, the taxation, revenue and expenditure, how does that impact the size of our deficit, and then how does that impact our debt? So when we experience stronger economic activity, it's likely to see an increase in taxation receipts and a decrease in welfare, which should reduce the size of the budget deficit. So we'll collect more income tax, company tax, GST, we'll pay less unemployment benefits. That will likely to see a fall in the size of the budget deficit, and then because the deficit gets smaller, it should help to reduce the size, either decrease how fast our debt is growing, or if that leads to a surplus, it should actually reduce the size of our government debt. So automatic stabilisers in a peak, they work to increase taxes and reduce welfare, which leads to reduction in deficits, which should lead to a slowdown in the pace of our debt. If they lead to surpluses, they'll lead to even less debt. During troughs, we experience decreased taxation revenue, more expenditure, and our debt grows a lot faster. So during our last boom in 07-08, we experienced strong economic growth, which helped to create budget surpluses, which reduced our government sector debt. Since the GFC, slower rates of economic growth have led to cyclical budget deficits, which required more government borrowing and higher government debt. So that relationship through automatic stabilisers and debt can be explained through deficits. It's an important study. If you get a question on automatic stabilisers and net government debt, make sure you talk about higher budget deficits, how that requires us to borrow more, sell more bonds, and that leads to bigger net government debt. In terms of peaks and the impact on net foreign debt and net government debt, peaks will generally see a decrease in net government debt because we generally run surpluses. So peaks are generally synonymous with reduced government debt because we run surpluses, but they can be associated with increased net foreign debt, which is very different because that includes things related to the CAD. So net foreign debt can go up during a peak because we import more, firms look to invest and borrow money, so private sector debt often goes up when we're in a peak, but government debt generally falls when we're in a peak. Net government debt is likely to fall in a peak, but net foreign debt can increase in a peak because of the cyclical nature of the CAD, the fact we import more and export. We don't necessarily export less, but we import more. Next video we'll talk about good versus bad debt.